What a great turnout, everyone. Sincerely, thank you. Thank you so much. This is, it's validating to have a nice response like we're having today, that there's interest in the programs that we're putting out, the topics and the guest presenters. So I very much appreciate you all being here, and we have quite an international response today. So thank you so much. For those that I've not met, I'm Geoff O'Keeffe. I'm the Executive Director of Zen Peacemakers, and I am honored and humbled and very pleased to have my longtime friend and teacher, Gerry Shishin Wick Roshi, as our guest presenter and teacher here today with us. And as you all know, because you signed up and you're here, Shishin will be talking about the 5 ranks of Zen. Sometimes we refer to Tozan's 5 ranks. And his book just dropped recently, and I accidentally bought 2 copies. So, Roshi, you can go out to lunch. At any rate, if you have not had a chance to read it, I'm going to just do a shameless plug. This is Roshi's book that just came out last couple of weeks, I think. And I did read it, and it is terrific. And I will let him put Tozan's 5 ranks into context of why we study this teaching and how it fits in with our Zen practice. So without any more from me, I'm going to mute myself. Roshi, I'm going to spotlight you. If you don't like that, you can put yourself back on gallery.
Yeah.
And I'm going to mute myself and let you take the talk.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Shoan, and thank you, everyone, for being here. It's great to see many friends in the Zen community. As Shoan said, my book on the 5 ranks of Zen was just published 12 days ago. It was available, and I studied the 5 ranks. We call it 5 ranks of Zen, and the book is the 5 ranks of Master Tozan. I studied with Maezumi Roshi, went through it in great detail, and it was a culmination of 13 years of Koan study with Maezumi Roshi. About 20 years ago, I thought that there needed to be some modern commentary on the 5 ranks. Has been some things written about them, but they were very didactic, I thought, and needed to bring it alive. But I didn't quite know how to do it. I was kind of like facing a sheer rock wall without any toe holds or finger holds, and I wasn't quite sure how to approach it. And I've sat with it for about 10 years and saw a little bit of light, but I talked to Bernie Glassman at that time and about it, and I said, would you be interested in collaborating on this? I'm just kind of at my wit's end. And he said, sure, let's do it. And so Bernie and I met a number of times in Montague, and I taped our conversations. And of course, what Bernie wanted to do was fit the 5 ranks into the 3 Zen Peacemaker tenets. And everything we talked about, he tried to use that as a template to fit everything into it. And he succeeded, I think, in reformulating one of the 5 ranks using the tenets, but then every one of the ranks has a verse, and he was trying to work on the verses, but finally we realized that wasn't going to work. So I still didn't start writing anything when Bernie had a stroke and then died a few years later. And it's been, I think, 6 years since Bernie died. And I spent those 6 years working on this book and finally got it in shape so that it was published. So it's been a long gestation and a difficult birth. So I hope from your perspective it's worth it, and it was worth it from mine. But when we study the koans with Maezumi Roshi, and Bernie was also a student with Maezumi Roshi, there's about 700 koans, and I look at the 5 ranks as koans. I don't look at it as a nice story or as liturgy. They're koans that we have to penetrate. And when we studied with Maezumi Roshi, we went through all of the books, the Mumonkan, the Blue Cliff Record, the Book of Equanimity, and then the Denko Roku, which is a transmission of light. And then we came to the 5 ranks of Tozan, and it's supposed to be the culmination of our koan practice. And I'm going to quote Master Hakuin, and I have this as an epigram in the book. Master Hakuin lived about 300 years ago, and he revitalized Rinzai Zen in Japan. And he said, how priceless is the merit gained through the step-by-step practice of the 5 ranks of the absolute and the relative. So he thought it was a tremendous practice, and the way I think about it is that it is a culmination of all of the koan study that we did. And in the book, I use the analogy that when I was studying physics as an undergraduate, there were distinct topics that we studied, like mechanics, like optics, like thermodynamics, like atomic physics, and electricity and magnetism, and they were taught as distinct subjects. Then when I went to graduate school, I got my advanced degree in physics. I started to learn that thermodynamics informs mechanics, and electricity and magnetism informs optics, and they all start informing each other, and so that eventually you see that they're all interrelated and connected. And of course, physicists are still looking for the grand theory that ties everything together. And in an analogous way, I think of the 5 ranks as tying together all of the years and 700 previous koans that I studied with Maezumi Roshi. So the 5 ranks were written by Tozan Ryokai, who is a Chinese Zen master who lived in the 9th century. So that, and we're in the 21st century. So, that's 1,200 years ago. And he was the founder of the Soto Zen school with his student Sozan. And that's in China. And then Dogen, when he came from Japan to China in the 13th century, he brought Soto Zen back to Japan, and he's considered the founder of Soto Zen in Japan. And so, since we study it, koans in the Rinzai tradition, but the Soto school doesn't study koans, I looked at how the 5 ranks are regarded in each school. And I already said that in the Rinzai school, of which Hakuin was a part, he said it's priceless. It's beyond any price we could put on it. But Dogen actually rejected the structured approach of the 5 ranks as a teaching method. But The interesting thing about Dogen is he rejected koans as a teaching method too. But if you read the Shobo Genzo, which is his masterpiece, almost every chapter is about a koan. And the same thing, you can find the 5 ranks of Tozan in all of his writings. So I contend that the 5 ranks are important for all schools of Zen. And it depends on how much we want to drill down into it and how much we really want to make it our own. So, as I mentioned in my book, there's 2 sets of 5 ranks that Tozan articulated, and you find that in the Tozan Roku, which means the teachings and doings of Master Tozan. And one of the 5 ranks is called the Hensho Goi. Goi means 5 ranks. The Hensho Goi. Hensho means relative and absolute. So it's about the relationship between the relative and the absolute. The second rank, 5 ranks, is called the Kokan Goi, and that means the sequence of merit. And the Kokan Goi are like a linear progression of practice, and they are similar to the 10 ox herding pictures of Zen, if you're familiar with them. And actually, I have an appendix in my book comparing the Kokan Goi to the 10 ox herding pictures. And one of the things that is important, and Shoan asked me about how we can relate this to beginning and advanced students. And the Hensho Goi, the relative and absolute, the very first one is talking about having an awakening experience. So without an awakening experience, it's hard to really penetrate to the relative and absolute 5 ranks. But the Kokan Goi, the very first rank, is called shift, which means that you have to shift your perspective and start practicing. So a beginner, I think, could do well to start there. It's the third Kokan Goi that talks about awakening. So we'll see how far we get into that. But an awakening experience is essential to understand the relative and absolute 5 ranks. So one thing I want to say is that the importance of the relative and absolute 5 ranks is that when we started practicing with Maezumi Roshi, the emphasis was on an awakening experience. I mean, everybody focused on that, having some kind of we call it kensho, which means to see into your true nature. And the relative aspect wasn't emphasized very much. And so what happened was we had people who had awakening experiences and then got stuck there. And the value of the relative and absolute is to show the importance of both aspects. It's just not the absolute that's important. And when people get stuck in the absolute, they tend to think that they're beyond any kind of accountability. And that's why I think we've had a lot of problems in Zen communities years ago, where people would think, well, I see the absolute, whatever I do is the absolute, so whatever I do, is perfect and complete as it is. Well, that's what we call Buji Zen. That means not seeing clearly. So that when we go through the relative and absolute, we begin to see how important it is not just to see the absolute, but to bring the absolute into our life so that it informs everything that we do. Now, one of the subtitle that the editors at Shambhala Press put in the book was Tozan's Path of Being, Non-Being, and Compassion. And they talked about the absolute and the relative truth. So what is the truth? Again, I tried to bring in an analogy from physics, which is the wave-particle duality back in when quantum mechanics was first being articulated in the last century. They would see that objects like electrons or light objects like photons sometimes behave like particles and sometimes they behaved like waves. And so the question would always come up, what are they? Are they particles or waves? And I remember reading something from Richard Feynman, the Nobel laureate physicist, who said that these objects, or whatever they are, sometimes they're waves, sometimes they're particles, but they're neither. Actually, there's something else, and we don't know what that something else is, and they just behave in this funny way. So if we look at our life, do we say, is it absolute or is it relative? Are we all one? Are we unified? Or are we diverse and separate? And so all we can say is that we're both, and if you try to look at one side of it, just the relative side or the absolute side, then you're not seeing the whole thing. So what Bernie calls the unity of everything, he called it life. And so, the 5 ranks of the relative and the absolute, I'm going to read them out of my book. The first one is called the relative in the midst of the absolute. The second is the absolute in the midst of the relative. So in the midst of our ordinary life, we experience the oneness. But living that oneness, we also see that it informs everything in our life. And so the way Bernie, using the Zen Peacemaker tenets, he said the first one is the relative bearing witness to the absolute. And the second one was the absolute bearing witness to the relative. So let me just give a small example of how to distinguish these two and what they mean. When Dogen, who I mentioned, who was founder of the Soto Zen in Japan, came to China, he was sitting with his teacher, Tendo Nyojo, and while the monks were sitting, Tendo Nyojo admonished them, and he said, each of you should drop off your body and mind. And Dogen took him literally. He dropped off his body and mind. And Maezumi Roshi used to say that to us in the Zen Center. He used to say it in Japanese. I even remember the Japanese. And he would go, Jin, Shin, Datsuraku. Drop off body and mind. And Dogen had this huge awakening experience from hearing those words, and he went in to see his teacher and bowed before him, and he said, why are you bowing? And he said, I've dropped off body and mind. And then his teacher, Tendo Nyojo, said, if you've dropped off body and mind, who is this standing before me? And Dogen said, the dropped off body and mind. You see the subtle difference there? So the very first of the Hansho Goi, the relative and absolute Goi, in Bernie's words, the relative bearing witness to the absolute, that is dropping off body and mind. The second one, the absolute bearing witness to the relative, that is the dropped off body and mind. So the dropped off body and mind functions just normally, standing, walking, sitting, eating, defecating, but it's the dropped off body and mind. In other words, there's nothing there that he's identifying as Dogen, the Japanese monk who came from Japan to China. It's the dropped off body and mind. And maybe That might give you a little sense of what I'm talking about. And I know that many of you know the Heart Sutra. You chant the Heart Sutra, and there's lines in the Heart Sutra that say, form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. Form is exactly emptiness, and emptiness is exactly form. This is like the relative and absolute. We could say the relative is exactly the absolute, and the absolute is exactly relative. And these are the first two of the five ranks also. And they are koans in our system. Form is emptiness is form. And so the students have to present each one of these, their understanding of it. And they're not the same. It's not like mathematics where you say A equals B and B means that B equals A. They're not the same. So those are also correspond to the first two ranks here. And I'll just briefly mention the next three. I'm not going to go into them in any depth here, but the third one is coming in the midst of the absolute. So that's really looking at what the nature of the absolute is. And Bernie said bearing witness to the absolute. That was his explanation of that rank. And the fourth one is reaching in the midst of the relative. And Bernie called that bearing witness to the relative. And that's where we really examine the nature of the relative. And then the last one is arriving in the midst of the absolute relative. In other words, it's one word, absolute relative, or unity attained, and Bernie called that bearing witness to life. And so he called life the container that holds everything. It's our life. And Maezumi Roshi used to always say, appreciate your life. That was something he said many times, to appreciate your life. So, but I want to make clear that for advanced students, they need to approach the five ranks. They need to come from their experience of practice. Whatever they've let go of body and mind, to whatever extent. And we say in koan practice, you need to use live words rather than dead words. And live words come from your experience. Dead words are conceptual, or academic. And I'm going to give you a small example of the difference between the two. There's a story of Soen Nakagawa Roshi that I heard, and he is one of the Roshis who came to the United States in the last century and helped spread the seed of Zen in the United States. And he was talking with a biblical scholar, and Soen Roshi said to him, what were the last words that Christ uttered on the cross? And the scholar said, my God, why have you forsaken me? And Soen Roshi said, no, that's not right. And then the scholar said, yes, that's what he said. My God, why have you forsaken me? And someone said, no, he didn't. And the scholar was getting a bit perturbed, and he said, look, he says, I know from my studies that's what he said. So if you say I'm wrong, then what did he say? And Soen jumped up, threw his arms out like he was nailed on the cross, and put his head to the side, and he said really loudly, mournfully, my God, why have you forsaken me? So this is a difference between live words and dead words. Soen Roshi actually embodied Christ on the cross, whereas the scholar was detached and talking about it. So when we look at these Goi, five ranks, each one of them has a title, and the title is a koan. What does it mean when we say the absolute in the midst of the relative? How can you present that from your experience of your life and your practice without getting conceptual. And then each one of the ranks has a verse, and every line of the verse is a koan. For example, in the first Hensho Goi, the 5 ranks of the relative and absolute, the verse is like this. Early in the evening, before the moon shines, it's no wonder they meet without knowing each other. But there is still the fascination of earlier beauty. Now, this rank is talking about a first awakening experience. So early in the evening before the moon shines, what kind of a state is that? It's dark, black, formless. And so it's describing a stage of letting go of everything, of letting go of one's attachment to self and attachment to other as well. And it's described, as a black lacquer ball, that very state. Okay, how do you present that? And then the next line, it's no wonder they meet without knowing each other. So in a way, that line is reminiscent of the first of the 3 Zen Peacemaker tenets, not knowing, maintaining a mind of not knowing. How do you maintain a mind of not knowing? See, when you let go of every preconception, every image, every idea, like in the first line, in the second line, you just don't know. You have don't know mind. They meet without knowing each other. It's not like strangers meeting. It's like meeting your intimate, true self, and you don't know it. Like if you meet somebody, your sibling, and I'm very happy to say one of my siblings is here. Glad to have you, Alan. And we've known each other for over 80 years. We're both in our 80s. And every time we meet, can we be fresh? Can we be not knowing? Can we be open to each other totally? That's what this line is about. And then the last line, but there is still the fascination of earlier beauty. Even though I've had this experience, I'm still holding on to something. I'm still fascinated by my image of a Zen master. That's got to go. Okay. So how do we, and then we go further, each one, we penetrate a little bit deeper, each one of the ranks. So it's important to realize that even after having awakening experiences, there's more practice, more awareness. And Master Hakuin said that post-Satori practice is more difficult than pre-Satori practice. That means after you've had an awakening experience, it's more difficult than before. And why would that be? And he says it's because of our habit-ridden consciousness. We all have habits that we've developed over our lifetime, and just having an awakening experience doesn't get rid of it. And many of the habits we have don't really serve us. They don't really help us. In fact, they're just unconscious reactions we have to things that we learned when we were young. And they don't just suddenly disappear. We have to work hard at them. And that's what some of these Goi express, is how to deal with this habit-ridden consciousness. Pride, pride in accomplishment, that's a big one. That's mentioned in here. And the example I like to use is like a big ocean liner. It's traveling at 30, 40 knots. And then suddenly they shut off the engine. You have an experience and the engine is shut off. But that doesn't stop the ocean liner. It just keeps going. It's going to go tens of miles before it stops. because of the momentum, that it has. And we have all kinds of momentum in our life, from the way that we think things should be or the way things ought to be. And so that's what the practice of the five ranks is about. So in the first one, if we say, I don't know, and that there's no self, again, how do I function? And that goes back to Dogen's, the dropped off body and mind. So the verse for the second rank of the relative and absolute explains, it says, at dawn, an old ignorant woman finds her ancient mirror, wherein she sees clearly her face, which cannot be elsewhere. No more will she reject her head by grasping at its shadow. So we see clearly who we are, and we see it in everybody. Years ago, when I was a student at the Zen Center in Los Angeles, I met an old monk who told me to see everybody as the Buddha. So how would we function? Like the old woman, she looks in the ancient mirror and she clearly sees her face, which can't be elsewhere. If we see the Buddha in everybody, how would we behave? And how can we do that? The only way we can do that is to set aside our own self-grasping ignorance to see the Buddha. And he also said, hear the Dharma in all sounds and see every place as nirvana, or as the enlightened place. So there's many verses that say the mountains are the shape of the Buddha's bodies, and the sound of the rivers are, his tongue speaking the Dharma. So everywhere we go, we can see that. And I have a chapter where I compare these five ranks, the relative and absolute, to a part of the Genjo Koan, a part of Dogen's very famous chapter in the Shobogenzo. And it starts out, to study the Buddha way, or to study Zen, is to study the self. And to study the self is to forget the self. In other words, if you really look for the self, you can't find it. You just have to let it go. And to forget the self is to be enlightened by the 10,000 dharmas. In other words, everything enlightens you. And then there's two more lines that go on, and I compare that to the relative and the absolute. So I talked a little longer than I'd anticipated, so I think I'll stop there and pass it over to Shoan, who wanted to make a few comments, and then we'll open it up to everyone. I can't hear you, Shoan.
Roshi, how about now?
I can hear you now.
Okay, microphone problems. Yeah, we want to open up for people's questions, and so hopefully you've read a bit of the book. Certainly many people here have studied the five ranks, so hopefully you made notes. But I wanted to get in one, maybe two here before. There's so much rich text in here that's just beautiful, and things you've said in the book, they overlap and they blend with other things too. So you spoke about this, but I want to read just two short paragraphs of yours, and maybe if you could comment on these. Ultimately, to awaken completely requires the dismantling of the very subtle, deeply embedded patterns of perception we've developed in this life. The slate must be wiped clean so that all that remains is the reality of life, with no filament or trace of egoic consciousness left. That's not an easy thing to do, yet it requires no effort. save the effort to manifest unconditional love, first for yourself, then extending to others. It is a deep commitment to stay present to that love in all conditions and all circumstances. I think that's a fairly complete teaching. Is that do you want to expand on that at all?
Well, if it's complete, I don't know if there's anything to expand on it, but I'll let it grow with a couple arms and legs here. But, while you were talking, reminded me of something I read from Rabindranath Tagore, who's a philosopher and sage and writer from India who won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And he said, I dreamed that life is joy. When I awoke, I saw that life is service. And then I realized that service is joy. So it's one of the big lessons that I learned in Zen is that our practice is to serve others. It's not to aggrandize ourselves. And I think that's what that paragraph speaks to. And when we serve others and forget about the self, then we don't behave according to our ego grasping consciousness. And that's what Bernie said. Quote, something just came to my mind from him. He says, you use all of the ingredients of your life, make the best meal possible, and then offer it to others. So that's what I think that means, is a life of service and not really worrying about any kudos or recognition, which is difficult to do because, we all want to be appreciated.
Yep. Yeah. So that's service being the unconditional love that you referred to.
Yeah.
I'm going to take a liberty here and just ask another one before we open up, because it connects directly. One of the notes I made, Roshi, was a story that you referenced in the book, but many of us who are your students have heard this over the years. And I can remember, 20 years ago or so, coming to you wanting to whine and complain about my work life and the bad behavior of superiors and so forth. And you had a very interesting perspective on that. And you talk about that in this book again, where after your time at Zen Center, returning to the workplace and your approach to how you related to superiors, people who reported to you, colleagues, kind of 360. And it really, it changed my mind at the time. It was really a gift. Can you say a little bit about that story?
Yeah. Well, I think that when I went back to work, I very quickly was put in a middle management position. So I had people I was reporting to and people who were reporting to me. And I think that a lot of people don't understand that you have to manage both upward and downward, in order to fill the whole spectrum. So if I was never afraid to hire people who were a lot smarter than I, and when I worked in the university for a professor who was one of the most brilliant people I worked for, he had a quote on his wall that said, there's no limit to what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit. Okay? There's no limit to what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit. And of course, you can't find out who originated that quote because the person who wrote it didn't want credit for it. So it was anonymous, right? So that was kind of an attitude I had. So I would hire people smarter than me, and then I would give them whatever resources they needed to fulfill the job. And then the other direction, I would do whatever I could in order to make my superiors look good by fulfilling my tasks on time and within budget. So I would support them up, those going up and upwards, and those who reported to me, I would support them as much as I could and encourage them. So I think that's, you have to learn how to manage both upward and downward. I think that's the key thing. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was a priceless lesson for me. We have quite a bit of time, folks, and we have a wonderfully esteemed group of folks in attendance here. There are more of you than I can see in one screen, so waving your physical hand is not going to work. I might miss you. Down under React, you'll find your electronic hand. If you've got a comment or question for Roshi on the book or on anything you shared or anything that relates, please go ahead and put up your little hand and let's have a bit of a dialogue for a while.
Shishin, I have my hand up. I hope I can go ahead. It's Grant.
Oh,
I loved seeing this august group gather to hear you, and you did not disappoint. Thank you. It was lovely. And I remember talking to you about when you were putting this together, and it's a great teaching. I have a simple question. And I've always loved seeing everyone as a Buddha and hearing every sound as the Dharma. And it's far easier to apply that, I think, in family and or business than it is in politics. Can you share how this is unfolding for you, the politics of the day, and how we can see everybody as a Buddha and everything we hear as the Dharma?
in the context of the present political situation, you mean?
Yes, I'll make it easy. Just keep it in the United States.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, everybody has their true nature, their essential nature, with prior, to thinking about it or committing it, I mean, we may not appreciate the actions of people, but that doesn't necessarily define who they are at the core, at the essence. I think, everybody has their problems. I think we can see that. Every situation, we can reframe it. And I actually give an example in the book, of our attitude towards it, where a man, was having to have an operation, and his kid got in a car accident and couldn't complete his schooling. And so they thought it was horrible. But then his wife looked at the situation and reframed it. And she says, "Oh, I mean, my husband has been bothered by these gallstones, and fortunately he's going to have an operation. He's going to get better. Our son had an accident, but, he survived and he's going to get better, so it just depends on our attitude. But if we see that everybody has the capacity, to realize the wisdom and compassion of the Buddha, some people, have more barriers than others because of their ego grasping consciousness. But we just try to see, it doesn't make people bad person just because they do things differently than we do. Now, as far as hearing every sound as the Dharma, if somebody's, talking about doing very destructive things, is that the Dharma? Well, I've thought about this a bit. I mean, I was thinking, the example that I see more is that at the Zen Center of Los Angeles, it's in the middle of Koreatown, and there's a lot of crime in that area. And when we were sitting zazen, we would hear the police helicopters overhead, and people would complain, we need to go to the mountains, and get away from this. So we bought a mountain property, and we built a zendo that had a corrugated tin roof on it. And when we were sitting zazen, the squirrels would drop pine cones on the corrugated tin roof, and they would make this horrible clatter, and they were screeching at each other, And so, can we hear the sound of the squirrels as the Dharma? Can we hear the sound of the police helicopter? That's the Dharma. And I'm just reminded, so people want to get away from the city. It's just different sounds, and can you stay focused no matter what's going on? And I remember this Far Side cartoon about these two bears in overcoats and hats in the city, and one's talking to the other. He says that when we come down from the mountains, it takes me a few days to unwind. So again, you can look at it in different ways. But it's really hard, I think, when we hear hateful speech, to hear that as a Dharma. And one thing I didn't mention in my talk was that we also study the precepts. That those of us who have had Jukai, we take the precepts. There's the 3 treasures and the 3 pure precepts and the 10 grave precepts. And one of the precepts is to not lie, But we have commentaries on this from Yasutani Roshi, who was Maezumi Roshi's teachers, and said that what the whole point of the precepts is to protect the Dharma, protect the truth, what the truth is. And so if you hear people who are destroying the Dharma, you have to speak out, and whether that's something that, is abhorrent, that's the teaching right there, that we have to respond to it in a way that is not only open, but and could include the other people in it, but we also have to show, just not let it go, just not let it go. So I think it's really tough, but again, we have to be careful that we don't think we know everything, because we don't, So how can we do it in a loving, open way if we feel something is being destructive to the Dharma as we see it? And one like Bernie, again, I'll quote Bernie, he said that the purpose of Zen practice is to realize the oneness and the interconnectedness of life, the oneness and interconnectedness. And if people are trying to destroy that, then we have to speak out, and we have to do it. That's a loving action that comes out of bearing witness to that. So that's the best I can do.
Grant, thank you for your question. Roshi, for your answer. Kip Kyoto, I see you have thank you for using your electronic hand.
I'll lower the hand.
Kyoto,
Thank
hi.
you, Shishin. Great to see you. Thank you for doing the Zoom. Thank you for putting out this book. I was lucky enough to use a pre-publication version with my first successor, who will be transmitting to next month. So we're just starting on the 5 ranks with him, and your book come out. I said, wow, look at this. It's a great resource. Of course, we use in our school, we have our texts and different versions of the verses, but it's so nice to see what you'd written for each of these ranks. The Goy, here I am, I'm Goy, and I'm working on the Goy with my successor. But one thing about, in relating to the previous conversation with that Grant had brought up, something that you had said really stuck. I seem to carry phrases from various teachers, great little things that they say, really nice things to use during the day, living my life. And one time in the 80s, you gave a talk at ZCLA, Maezumi Roshi had recently gone into Scripps for work on his alcoholism. And you said a really great thing to set this up. You said, Roshi is an alcoholic. I am an alcoholic. I don't know if you remember that, but when I see something that I don't like, I am that thing that I don't like. And that's something that has really helped me for these decades. So I wanted to thank you for that and bring that up in the political situations. I don't like what's going on. I am that.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it's a really helpful grounding. And then after that, then what do we do? But that's a great way to frame it. So just wanted to thank you for that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for reminding me. Yeah.
Do you have anything more to say on that, or is it complete as you said earlier?
Yeah, I think like what you said is if we don't demonize other people and create a gap or a separation, then there's more opportunity for discourse and, at least to not be enemies. Thank you.
Hey, do we have others with comments? We have time, and Gyoro, please.
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Roshi, so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it, and I'm really enjoying the book. And I was blessed to be able to work on the Five Ranks with you, as a student, and I still, draw from that teaching as well. My question is about the terms of relative and absolute, and you kind of map them to form and emptiness. And, I find working, both in my own understanding and working with students, sometimes these can get kind of abstract. So I wonder what you think about talking about compassion and wisdom as the main practices of the absolute and the relative, and then to look at wisdom holding compassion and compassion holding wisdom, and looking at these different relationships of those two things.
I certainly think they map to actually some of the translations said a relative and absolute. They use the lord and the vassal, or the real and the apparent. But wisdom is the functioning of the absolute, and compassion is the functioning of the relative. So I think that we can look at it like that, like when so if it conveys all of the subtleties of it, I think that's fine. But I think that we can, that it's another layer on top of it, which I think is fine. It can be a upaya, a skillful means, but I don't think that we should stop with wisdom and compassion. I think I have to go a little deeper, even though it might seem abstract. But like what I said in the book, it's about the experience of the absolute. We can't talk about the absolute without the experience. And I use some simple examples, if we don't have a shared experience, we can't talk about anything, really. The example I use in the book is, how can you explain to somebody how to walk who's never, we all know we can talk about it, but how do you walk? What do you do when you walk? You know what the experience of it is, but you don't think about it. You don't say to the synapses and the muscles, move, contract, expand, or whatever, as we learn how to walk from hard experience, like from falling on the ground as toddlers and falling against furniture. But so these are not abstract concepts. These are experiences. And how do we experience these things? So wisdom and compassion are things that people can get their hands around, so they think they understand it. They have to be careful.
Mm.
Oh, yeah. There's one other thing I was thinking of. Anyway, maybe I'll think of it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful.
Okay. Oh, I know what it was. One of the Hakuin's famous koan, what is the sound of one hand? And people in the popular press and people who don't really understand Zen change that to what is the sound of one hand clapping? And that's not the koan, is what is the sound of one hand? So they add the clapping part to try to think that they can conceptually understand what it's about. So that's, I guess, what I just want to caution you.
Thanks, Gato. Thanks, Roshi. Roshi Ken, you've got your hand up. Thank you.
Thank you. So,
Oh, Ken. Hi, Ken.
hi, thank you so much. I have kind of a request, and then I want to come back to Grant's comment and your response. But I'm hoping you'll talk a little bit more about the second, whatever they're called, the second set of five.
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
that I need more help with, even than I do with the first set, I think. But I guess the question I had, you in talking about hateful speech. So what in one of these ranks, you're hearing hateful speech from the point of view of the absolute, right?
Yeah.
The absolute, hateful speech is my speech, right? It's all my speech.
Well, in the absolute, there is no hateful or joyful.
There's no other either, right?
Yeah. I mean, that only comes up in the relative.
So whatever that speech is that we're inclined to label as hateful
Yeah.
is mine,
Yeah.
not just other. Is
Yeah.
that right?
Yeah. But if it's disturbing the fabric of the reality, of the oneness, then it can be labeled as hateful.
And it's coming from me.
Well,
However I vote.
in the absolute, there's no me and no other, but in the relative, yeah, there is other and self. So, I mean, we can't get confused about it. And I think that's something we have to be really reflect carefully on, Yeah. I mean, we respond to things. We have to look and see where our hooks are. What are we responding to? Now, somebody might say something that's not divisive, but we interpret it that way. Then it's coming from us and we react to it because we have a hook or a spot that they're touching that we react to. We have to. That's why Dogen said to study Zen is to study the self. We have to really be very clear about what we're reacting to in our own habit-ridden consciousness and what we're projecting. So I don't think it's that simple. I think it's very subtle and nuanced, and we have to be very careful about it. Yeah.
I mean, you think it's fair to say that what we hate are the aspects of ourselves that we're rejecting?
Yeah, I think I have a quote in there from Jesus that says that what we ignore will come back and kill us. That's not exactly the quote. I can look it up. Yeah. Yeah, but I think you're right. Dan. Yeah. Oh, well, it's not in the index. So anyway, yeah. Okay. Anything else? No. Okay.
Thanks, Ken. And I see Gary's got his hand up. However, our friend Chris Shinmyo is in a noisy place. I didn't know there were noisy places on Vancouver Island, Chris. And so he can't unmic, but he did write out a question, Roshi, if I may. I always look at teachings on the importance of not acting in order to self-aggrandize. We can accomplish anything if we don't care who gets credit, right? But I see so much modification and commercialization in Buddhism today with people using it to become famous. This always fills me with dismay. The era of counterfeit dharma, indeed, but I wonder whether you feel there's a way in which such actions are actually in the service of the dharma.
Hmm. Well, I'm a firm believer that the more people who meditate or practice are aware of it, the better. I used to be real purist, but I think that the more people who practice, I think it'd be wonderful if, Trump would engage in some self-reflection, or anybody, and one of the things that Maezumi Roshi, I think, instilled in his senior students was not let the Dharma seed die. Well, not everybody's going to be a vessel to carry on the Dharma generation after generation. Everybody will be a vessel to carry it on in their own life as best they can. But even in the time of Dogen, when they had thousands of monks in monasteries, how many of them became teachers? So, but still, I think that if enough people have the mind of awareness, of the oneness and interconnectedness of life, then eventually there might be enough people for a chain reaction to carry this forward. But I remember traveling and I was in a hotel once and they had Zen soap in the bathroom in the hotel. So it worked well, cleaned me off. Yeah. But yeah, if people, want to use the word Zen, it'll just make people more aware of it. So, but if people are using it in order to aggrandize themselves, yeah. Like there's the cartoon of the guy who said, 30 minutes of mindfulness a day and I can conquer the world. And his guru said, 2 hours of mindfulness a day and you won't need to.
Yeah. Chris, I hope that helped. I know you can't unmute because you have noisy Doug furs around you somewhere. So, there he is. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Gary Beard, go ahead and unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I'm Gary. I also go by Bowden.
Okay.
And I am, as part of my practice, I was hesitant to raise my hand, but just to share, this is an assertive practice I do to say something in the midst of people that I look at as strangers, but I trust are friends. So thank you for hearing me. I wanted to comment on the political thoughts that were coming out and just to put out a strategy or two that I use that helps me because I get really wound up. So I practice in order to see myself. And so what I see is, years ago, I had weekly meetings with a man that was bipolar. And while I am myself not bipolar, I was struck that we're all on a continuum and that certainly I have aspects on the spectrum, and we're all on the spectrum somewhere. And so when I think of the political things, I think in terms of seeing myself and these really difficult characteristics that I have that really I can be way too persistent or way too analytical. So I think we just manifest what I see in others as perhaps, let's say, willful ignorance. It's helpful to me to just see that as the location where their neuroses manifest and mine perhaps do not, but I sure have them elsewhere. And so I keep that in mind. And I also try to look at them and myself with those eyes that I looked at my children when they were children. They're now adults, but when they were most vulnerable and most certainly innocent without intention of maliciously waking me up in the middle of the night. And I could look at them with complete love and understanding. And in spite of whatever irritation or inconvenience I felt. So sometimes these are strategies that I find helpful. It's a very difficult time. And I have a relative that with whom we can't seem to meet. And so there's a place, a way in which we have to learn to look past these deeply held opinions and give up those attachments. Anyway, no solutions, but I appreciate being able to listen and learn and talk with you. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Let's see. Get back to my broader view here. Roshi, can you hear me okay? I'm
Yeah.
looks like I may be freezing. Oh, good. Hi, Eve. Good to see you. Thank you for being here.
Wow, such for me, it's a real privilege to listen to Shishin speak about the Five Ranks, which are my favorite koans. I shared that with him. Thank you so much. I want to ask you about these words, relative and absolute, which I have disliked and felt uncomfortable with from the very beginning of practice. I just think they're bad words. I think they're very dead words. Even for word people, they're very dead words. So I speak with people who are not Buddhists, and I always feel, well, we have the absolute and they have God. And I'm very aware as a Jewish person, there's a lot of conditioning and mental pictures of God and adjectives and all these things, how people characterize God. But God is also used in many ways by people to point to something that is beyond human cognition, beyond perception. It evokes mystery for them. It evokes huge, like a challenge. It evokes a lot of things. The absolute for me doesn't evoke anything. And maybe it's not supposed to. It's supposed to be, we use the word empty. But I was curious if you had any comments about this terminology, or of course we're not theistic. We don't have that image but I struggle with our terminology and things that are not conveyed. Yeah, I struggle with that, especially when I speak with people who are non-Buddhists. And I wonder what your experience has been with that.
Well, let me ask you, Eve, thank you for that. But let me ask you, what words would you prefer? Have you thought about it quite a bit? So have you come up with anything?
No, I haven't. And I know Bernie's thought about it, And I remember once in Shishin, maybe there were a couple of people there, Peter Matheson was there, and they argued about those words. And Peter was, a tremendous writer. He also disliked those words, but we couldn't come up, they didn't come up with anything. And that's been a lifelong frustration for me in practice. So I wondered if you had any comments about that.
Well, I didn't innovate very much. I just took what I learned from Maezumi Roshi. And people don't like the word ranks either, the 5 ranks, because it implies a progression, and it's not necessarily a progression. And some teachers use the word modes or positions, but I just took it because that's the way I worked with Maezumi Roshi, and we use relative and absolute. But in the book, I use other things like sacred and profane, or secular and divine, but they're just kind of aspects of it. They don't cover the whole thing. And in one part of the book, I'm trying to show that there can't be a separation between the relative and absolute. We have aspects of all of it, particularly in Buddhism, but I mentioned in both Judaism, Christianity, and Islam that they have teachings like Jesus says, the kingdom of God is within you. It's not, God isn't out somewhere else, someplace else, doing something else. But I think what you use the word mystery, and I use that word a lot in the book. It is a mystery. And God is a mystery. I mean, and in some branches of Judaism, you can't even speak the word or write the word. But so the mysterious, we have a lot of other words. We have Buddha nature, true self, but we don't use the word God as such. But, that's what it is. That's what the absolute is. It's that mysterious, I don't know if I want to use the word energy or consciousness, that it's ineffable, can't be described. And then the relative is just phenomenal world. Yeah. So I hope that I unpack those words in the book, so that they make more sense. But you're absolutely right. They are abstract, and it's hard to really grab onto it. But I think that's not such a bad thing, because if people think they understand it, then they they stop exploring. And then they think, oh, I've got it, but then that's not it. If you think you got it, that's not it. That you're smiling. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Noel G, I get a message that you have your hand up. Oh, there you are.
Hi.
There you are.
Can y'all hear me okay?
Perfect.
Yeah. Lovely to meet you all. My name's Noel for GU. Greetings from Reno, Nevada. It's currently very cold right here. But so I am in the process of becoming a teacher. I'm still sewing my first okesa. I'm part of this little sangha here in town. We're starting to grow. One of the things that we tend to do when we get new members is we do a unit on Dongshan. So we'll go into the 5 ranks. We'll go into Jewel Mirror Samadhi. But we tend to lose some folks. Some of the arcadeness or just the indirectness with people sort of first joining us. We get some confusion. We get some people that get a little, I'm not finding good words for it, but it's overwhelming and abstract in ways that confuse folks. So I was wondering, as somebody who has spent a lot of time thinking about these thinking about the five ranks and teaching the five ranks, if you had any advice for being a more skillful communicator about them.
Well, excuse me. Why do you feel it's necessary to bring the five ranks into new people who come into your center?
More so, we try and do a unit on it at least once a year.
Mhm.
And sort of, we have a bunch of new people who have come out of the woodwork in the last couple, in the last month or two. We're starting to get more as people are seeking places to sit quietly. Tumult in the world, and it's a teaching that's important to my current teacher. Just as I don't know, sort of as you were describing, a way of sort of moving beyond hierarchies and flattening things out and getting past the ideas of direct attainment. Because like one of the things we feel it's responsible to do is to do some myth busting early. It's like, you're not gonna, sort of, we're not making Buddhas on the cushion.
Well, in my book, I give a lot of other teachings that map to the five ranks. And I think they might be more approachable, like Dogen's Genjo Koan, study Zen is study the self, and study self is forget the self, instead of going directly to the five rings, which are more abstract, which people have commented on already. But find something that includes that teaching, but isn't as intractable. Did you say you're in Taos?
In Reno, Nevada.
Oh, Reno. Okay. All right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So, I would do that because I do think that the five ranks, we study them at the very end of koan practice. So you can let people know they exist, but I think it's tough to try and present something like that to people who are just new to the practice. Or the second of the five ranks, the first one is shift. What you could ask the students what shifted in them that brought them to practice. And submission, which is or surrender. What do you need to let go of in order to continue to practice? So you can make it more personal.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you for that question. And I think Roshi mentioned this, but for those that have the book, the 8th chapter, New Perspectives on the Hensho Goi, is a real gift because Roshi lays out the five ranks next to Genjo Koan, next to the Zen Peacemakers' 3 tenets, and makes it, really makes it approachable and consumable that way. So I would point folks with those questions to in that direction. We're running low on time, but I want to try to get everybody in here, and thank you all for stepping up. David, Helen, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. I'm fairly new to all of this. And in my sitting at a Zendo, I've ever since the beginning, I've struggled with much of the language. And recently, I heard David Hinton speak. And there was something about his work in Chinese Chan and translations. And so I've been reading slowly his book, China Root, which in the subtitle includes Original Zen. And he suggests that in the transition into Japanese Zen, into American Zen, there's something that has not been brought. And again, it's very new to me, but there's something that he's saying in the way he's saying it that suggests to me that's something that I've been looking for. I can't go into details other than for me, there's been something missing. And he provides the possibility, again, I'm very new to this, that there is something he's offering from his work in Tao and Chan and translations in Chinese that suggests what's been missing for me. So it's all a big question for me, but I'm finding something that is reassuring with what he's exploring. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, David. And Barbara, I know you had your hand up earlier. I don't know if you had to leave or if you changed your mind.
I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah. What reference to the root? What? So regarding words, so this jewel mirror begins in China. It's a Taoist mind that speaks this. And I like how what I have is an original translation. It's Dharma of thusness. So I understand what David is saying about our Western mind with our alphabet is not how these words were originally brought up. So I understand that conflict. So, but I love this statement, thusness, sort of. I like that one. Thank you.
You like the word thusness?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. How about suchness?
And that also.
Okay.
Such as this.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. We've got a couple of minutes here. If anyone else has anything you want to ask or comment on?
This is Frank.
Oh, Frank, I don't see your hand, but I, if you want to speak, please go ahead and unmute. Good to see you.
Good to see you all. It's really nice to be here and to join this talk. I have a question for Roshi. In the poems, there is a line that always spoke to me a lot. It's in the series on practice, the Gokun Goi. And it's the second poem, and it says, "The cuckoo's call urges the traveler to return home." I haven't read your book. Here in Europe, it hasn't arrived yet, but would you please say something to these maybe two lines? The cuckoo's call urges the traveler to return home. Its note continues when all flowers have fallen.
Well, if I remember correctly, the cuckoo's call is kind of a mournful call. And I think that's in the Kokan. I think it's in the first of the Kokan Goi. Let me see.
Second.
No, wait a minute. No, where is it? No, it's in the second. The cuckoo's call urges the traveler to turn home. And the second Kokan Goi is called submission or surrender. And the cuckoo's call apparently is a very mournful, nostalgic sound. And so it's references somebody who's feeling kind of incomplete or not fulfilled, and it's calling him to turn home, to find the place where he's always at home, his true home, to his true self. And so that's what that line references, you know. So I'm not happy the way things are. What am I going to do? You know? And so that's the cuckoo calling. And what this rank is saying, you just have to just keep letting go of your attachments. Just have to keep letting go. Yeah.
I always felt a little bit that the cuckoo's call is also this deep longing we have, which is already kind of wisdom. You know, it calls us, keeps calling us.
Yeah, I think you're right, Frank. Yeah, it is. It's a deep longing. Yeah.
Mhm. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you, Frank.
Yeah, nice.
Thank you, Frank. We're getting close to the end. I want to share just one short quote, and then I'll ask Roshi to wrap us up. I think this is these are his words. I think this is my favorite short passage. Surrender means you know in every fiber of your being that there's no one here living this life. Yet there is life flowing through the body, heart, mind, personality for so long as it lasts. There is no self, and that no self is walking, talking, working, and playing. End of the quote. And as an aging man who is much more aware of how long this is going to last, I might add falling down. We all start falling down more like we do when we're little kids. So Roshi, I'll if you want to, you can comment on that, or no need, or if you'd like to wrap us up, either way. So over.
Yeah. Well, that's a theme that we've been talking about quite a bit, you know, that it's the dropped away body and mind. Yeah. That the problem is, you know, that we think everything, we take ownership of it in order to solidify ourselves. You know, all of our ideas, our thoughts, even those, are they ours? I think it was Soyen Shaku, who was the first Zen master to come to the United States, said that realize that your body and mind are not your body and mind, but that the body and mind of everyone. And so if we let go of that ownership, that grasping mind, then what unfolds? And all we can say is we don't know. It's a mystery, but I think we'll find out that it's more expansive than when we keep grasping on to things. Yeah. So maybe I'll leave it at that. And I just want to thank everybody for your participation and your feedback. And as they say at the end of the Shuso Hosen ceremony, I hope I haven't tainted you and to wash my words out of your ears.